The road that led back to the village stretched like a thin ribbon of memory, unfolding slowly before her as she approached the coastline. The wind carried the unmistakable scent of salt and damp stone, the same scent she remembered from years ago when leaving this place had felt like liberation. Now, returning at 52, she felt the weight of every step, as if the land itself remembered her hesitations, her attempts to disappear, her effort to build a life far from the judgments she'd grown up breathing. She parked near the old main square, where the cobblestones were still uneven and the facade still carried the pastel tones restored by generations of families who never left. She stepped out of the car with the careful composure she had perfected over the years, a blend of dignity and caution, as if her presence might disturb a balance others cherished. The afternoon light fell softly over her face, accentuating the fine lines that told more truths than she ever allowed others to hear. She adjusted her coat, inhaled deeply, and walked toward the inn her sister had reserved for her. Nothing in this place had changed. Not the houses leaning slightly against the wind. Not the murmurs of neighbors gathered on porches. Not the instinctive way people lifted their eyes to observe whoever passed, measuring them, placing them, cataloging them. That familiar gaze brushed over her again, awakening an old echo inside her. Not pain, exactly, but a sensation of being underexposed and overanalyzed at the same time. She moved forward with steady steps. She had promised herself she wouldn't shrink, not even in the subtle way she used to, not even if the air here tried to mold her back into the version of herself she had fought so hard to leave behind. The wedding preparations were already visible around the village. White ribbons tied to lantern posts, floral arrangements transported in small carts, and the distant sound of tools against wood from the rustic hall near the cliffs. Her sister had always been the one celebrated, the one adorned by attention without effort. That reality no longer stung, but it was impossible to forget how naturally everything had always gravitated toward the younger one. She reached the inn and stepped inside. The warmth of the interior contrasted with the cold air outside, creating a brief fog on her glasses. As she removed them to clean the lenses, she sensed someone watching her, not with curiosity or judgment, but with a calm sort of awareness. When she lifted her eyes, she saw him across the room. He was younger, unmistakably, perhaps 28, maybe a little older. He carried himself with a quiet steadiness, as if he belonged neither to the loud clusters of people, nor to the silent corners. His gaze did not pierce her. It acknowledged her. There was no flicker of surprise at her age, no hurried attempt to pretend he hadn't been observing her. Only an honest, composed recognition, like he was registering her presence the way one registers a change in the weather. Inevitable, unforced. She returned his gaze for a second longer than intended. It wasn't interest. It wasn't attraction. It was a moment of unexpected equilibrium, as if he understood something she hadn't shown. She checked in, received the key, and headed to her room. As she walked down the narrow corridor, she noticed his figure passing behind her reflection in the small framed mirror on the wall. He carried a box of folded linens, likely helping the innkeeper prepare for the influx of guests arriving for the wedding. His steps were unhurried, and though he didn't look her way again, she felt the imprint of that earlier glance lingering inside her. In her room, she placed her luggage by the window and looked out toward the cliffs. The sea crashed below them in rhythmic surges that seemed to echo her thoughts, steady, persistent, impossible to silence. She had returned because duty required it, because avoiding the wedding would only feed new stories about her supposed distance, her supposed pride, her supposed inability to be part of the family. She returned because she was tired of being misinterpreted in her absence. Maybe being misinterpreted in her presence would feel different. She sat on the edge of the bed and let her shoulders drop. Returning here always demanded a kind of emotional posture she had never mastered. But something in that young man's calm expression had shifted the air around her arrival. Not enough to reassure her, but enough to remind her she wasn't as invisible, or as defined by others, as she once believed. She took another slow breath, absorbing the muffled sounds of guests checking in downstairs, and braced herself for the days ahead. The wedding. The relatives, the whispers, the subtle comparisons. the resurfacing of roles she had long outgrown. She would walk through all of it with quiet resilience. And somewhere in the background, without her understanding why, the presence of that younger man remained as a small, steady note in the atmosphere. Unclaimed, unexplained, but undeniably there. The wedding hall stood near the edge of the cliffs, built from weathered wood that bore the marks of countless celebrations. Entering it felt like stepping into a memory she had never fully belonged to, a place designed for gatherings she often avoided. The interior was filled with the scent of fresh flowers, polished tables, and the faint murmur of relatives rehearsing greetings they would later deliver with perfect artificial warmth. She moved slowly through the space, her gaze absorbing the details with a quiet discipline. The hall was arranged meticulously. White linens, delicate arrangements of pale roses, chairs aligned with almost military precision. Her sister had always loved flawless presentations. The family expected nothing less. As she walked among the tables, she felt the old sensation rise in her, an awareness of being evaluated not by her presence, but by the contrast she inevitably created. The glances from distant cousins, the subtle tightening of mouths from aunts who believed they understood her, the nearly invisible lift of eyebrows from those who had followed her life from afar, filling in gaps with their own assumptions. She had promised herself she would not internalize any of it, yet the air itself seemed to whisper comparisons, weaving them between the tables like stray threads she could trip on if she didn't move carefully. She paused near the head table, observing the floral centerpiece arranged in layers of white and soft green. Her sister's touch was unmistakable, elegant, controlled, precise. Standing there, she remembered past celebrations where she had sat quietly, overshadowed by a younger sibling who drew attention with ease. Those memories weren't sharp enough to wound anymore, but they carried a dull weight she couldn't shake. Movement near the entrance caught her attention. The young man from the inn entered the hall carrying 2 polished wooden crates. His steps were steady, his posture relaxed, as if he were untouched by the tension that saturated the room. He placed the crates beside a table and exchanged a few words with the wedding planner who pointed toward the stage area. He noticed her presence only after lifting one of the crates. Their eyes met briefly, just long enough for her to sense that he saw beyond her poised exterior. There was a quiet recognition in his expression, the kind that made her feel unexpectedly grounded, even in a space where she usually felt displaced. She walked away, not out of discomfort, but because she needed to maintain her control. Allowing any reaction to surface, even something subtle, felt like a risk she wasn't willing to take here. She examined the seating chart displayed near the entrance. Her name was written in elegant cursive, placed next to relatives who had perfected the art of gentle criticism. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinctive bracing for questions disguised as concern. The chart confirmed what she already knew. She was expected to be present yet peripheral, visible yet unacknowledged in any sincere way. As she studied the arrangement, she saw reflections in the polished glass frame, groups of guests forming circles, exchanging updates, planning their conversational strategies. She had no desire to join them. She had never mastered the art of weaving herself into shallow interactions. A faint sound behind her made her turn. The young man was adjusting the lighting fixtures above the tables, his movements precise and deliberate. He didn't seem to belong to any of the noisy clusters forming around the room. He worked quietly, observing without intruding, present without imposing. It struck her as unusual. Someone so young carrying a stillness she had only found in people twice his age. She walked toward the far corner of the hall, where sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust particles drifting like soft fragments of memory. She touched the wooden frame, its surface smooth from years of celebrations. Standing there, she felt both inside and outside the moment, as if the hall itself remembered her past discomforts. The conversations grew louder as more relatives entered. A few approached her with carefully practiced smiles, complimenting her outfit, remarking on her arrival, commenting on the distance she lived from them, as if geographical space explained emotional distance. Their words were light, but their tone carried old patterns, familiar and predictable. She responded with polite composure, allowing their comments to dissolve in the air before they could attach themselves to her. She refused to let their assumptions take root again. From across the room, she sensed the young man's gaze move toward her, not intrusively, but as if he were subtly reading the undercurrents she navigated. She didn't look back. She simply felt it, a quiet acknowledgement, an invisible anchor. And in a hall filled with polished appearances and ancient silences, that small, steady awareness made her feel, for the first time since arriving, that she was not entirely alone. The morning of the rehearsal began with a light mist resting over the village, softening the edges of the streets and blurring the distinctions between past and present. She walked slowly toward the gathering point near the small chapel where the family would rehearse the procession, her steps tracing familiar routes she had once hurried through, desperate to escape the weight of expectations. Now, even with decades of life lived far beyond these roads, the familiar heaviness returned, not painful, but persistent. She arrived early, hoping for quiet before the others filled the space with chatter disguised as affection. The courtyard was empty except for a gardener trimming the edges of the path and arranging potted plants near the entrance. The scent of damp stone lingered in the air, reminding her how this village held memories not with sharp clarity, but with a muted permanence, like old photographs left too long in the sun. As she waited, she noticed her reflection in the chapel's window, faint, slightly distorted. She didn't look away. The woman staring back was composed, but her eyes carried the echoes of years spent being measured by comparisons she never invited. Growing up, the idea of worth had often been handed to her in fragments. Her appearance weighed against her sister's charm, her steadiness overshadowed by her sister's ease with attention. Those old dynamics still clung to family gatherings, resurfacing in remarks that seemed harmless to those who spoke them. Voices approached from the path, and soon relatives began to gather. Laughter erupted in bursts as they hugged one another, exchanging predictable comments. The moment they saw her, their expressions shifted into practiced warmth, compliments mixed with subtle assessments. Her hair, her posture, the way she carried herself. She had learned to receive these observations with quiet neutrality, but inside, she felt the familiar tightening of old roles settling around her, like an inherited garment she could never quite discard. Her sister arrived shortly after, radiant in a soft cream dress, welcoming everyone with an ease that seemed almost choreographed. As always, conversations bent naturally toward her, about the wedding, about her choices, about how effortlessly everything fit around her. The protagonist watched from a short distance, recognizing the old choreography, admiration flowing in one direction while she remained slightly outside the circle, acknowledged but not truly seen. She positioned herself near a row of benches, pretending to admire the floral arrangements. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the coastline in muted shades of blue and gray. She focused on the horizon, using its steadiness to counterbalance the shifting dynamics around her. Movement at the edge of the courtyard drew her attention. The young man from the inn appeared, carrying a small toolbox, likely there to assist with decorative adjustments. His presence felt unexpected, yet strangely grounding. He approached the chapel with deliberate steps, greeting the wedding planner before setting down his tools. He didn't insert himself into conversations, nor did he seem intimidated by the lively clusters forming around him. Their eyes met briefly across the courtyard. Unlike the relatives, he did not assess or compare. His gaze held a quiet acknowledgement, as if he sensed the undercurrent of tension she navigated, even without knowing the history behind it. She looked away first, not out of discomfort, but because the familiarity of that attention stirred something she couldn't fully name. As the rehearsal began, the family moved into position. Roles were assigned, instructions delivered, corrections made. She followed along, maintaining her composure even as small comments surfaced. Remarks about how gracefully her sister moved, how youthful she looked, how everything suited her. Compliments layered upon compliments, each one harmless, yet each one reinforcing the old hierarchy that had shaped their childhood. She felt those comparisons settle in the air like dust, fine enough to ignore yet impossible to escape completely. She hadn't expected them to sting after so many years, but maybe the ache wasn't pain. It was the memory of an old wound pressed gently, reminding her it had never fully disappeared. During a pause in the rehearsal, she stepped aside to breathe. The young man approached the stage area, adjusting a string of lights. He seemed attuned to the room, attentive to details others overlooked. She noticed how he positioned himself at the edge of gatherings, present but not entangled in the swirling conversations. At one point, their paths crossed near the entrance. He didn't speak, of course, but something in his steady expression offered a quiet balance to the surrounding noise. It wasn't connection, not yet. It was simply the feeling of being seen without being evaluated. Her sister's laughter echoed behind them, bright and effortless. A group of relatives called out compliments, praising how perfect everything looked. She observed the scene with an almost detached clarity, realizing how deeply etched these patterns were, and how, despite the years and distance, she still felt the gravitational pull of being compared. But as she turned to leave the chapel, she felt the presence of the young man linger behind her, not imposing, not demanding, only quietly aware. And for the first time that morning, she felt a faint shift inside her, like the beginning of a new space opening where comparisons had once taken root. The evening before the wedding held a kind of ceremonial tension, a quiet anticipation woven into the air as guests gathered for the pre-ceremony dinner. The hall was lit with warm golden light, casting gentle shadows along the wooden beams overhead. The tables had been arranged with deliberate elegance, linen tablecloths pressed perfectly, silverware placed with exacting precision, centerpieces blooming in soft whites and greens. Everything looked curated to convey harmony, as if visual perfection might conceal the fractures beneath it. She entered the room with slow, measured steps, absorbing the polished atmosphere. Conversations hummed softly at first, then grew louder as more guests arrived. Laughter mixed with superficial pleasantries, rising and falling like the ebb of a tide. She felt herself slipping into the familiar posture of quiet presence, neither inviting nor resisting attention, simply navigating the space with calm resilience. Her seat was placed near the center of the room, surrounded by relatives known for their talent in disguising criticism as kindness. As she approached the table, a few turned toward her with warm smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Compliments drifted toward her, comments on her dress, on how well she looked, on how graceful she remained. The tone was polite, but she could sense the underlying comparisons, the subtle reminders of how differently she had aged compared to her sister's youthful glow. She settled into her seat, smoothing the fabric of her dress across her lap. The conversations around her rose quickly, carrying updates about careers, houses, vacations, topics that marked status more than connection. She listened with the detachment of someone who had learned long ago that participating often led to being subtly diminished, whether through backhanded compliments or carefully concealed surprise that her life hadn't aligned with their expectations. Across the room, she noticed the young man carrying a tray of freshly filled glasses. He moved with quiet precision, weaving between tables without disturbing the flow of conversation. His posture held an ease that contrasted sharply with the performative energy filling the hall. He wasn't pretending to belong, nor was he trying to disappear. He simply existed in the space, grounded and attentive. Their eyes met briefly. He didn't smile, but there was a soft recognition in the way he paused before continuing to another table. It wasn't curiosity. It was awareness, the kind that felt almost protective in its simplicity. Food was served in elegant courses. Her relatives commented enthusiastically about the dishes, turning each bite into an opportunity to display refinement. She ate slowly, her senses half focused on the flavors and half attuned to the conversations weaving around her. At one point, an aunt leaned toward her. Her voice dipped in sweetness as she remarked on how wonderful her sister looked for her age. The implication hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Another relative chimed in, praising the sister's vitality, her charm, her enduring youthfulness. The comparisons fell softly, but the weight of them pressed against her chest, stirring memories she wished had faded. She maintained her calm, offering polite nods, allowing the comments to drift past her like harmless wind. But inside, she felt the familiar constriction of old expectations tightening. As the dinner progressed, The room grew louder. Guests became more animated, sharing stories punctuated by laughter. Her sister sat at the head table, glowing under the attention, her gestures fluid and effortless. The protagonist observed her with a mixture of affection and distance, recognizing the patterns that had shaped their relationship, patterns that still lingered, even now. Near the end of the meal, the young man returned to adjust a slightly tilted centerpiece on her table. His movements were subtle, but close enough for her to sense the intention behind them. He didn't look at her directly, yet she felt his presence as a quiet anchor, calm, unobtrusive, grounding. When he stepped away, she found herself exhaling more deeply than she meant to. It surprised her how someone she barely knew could create a small pocket of ease in a room filled with polished expectations. After dessert, the conversations shifted toward tomorrow's ceremony. Guests speculated about the weather, the schedule, and the speeches to be given. Her name surfaced in passing. Someone whispered that she would likely keep her remarks brief, as she always did, and others nodded knowingly, as if that small detail confirmed their assumptions about her. She felt the sting of their certainty, not because it was cruel, but because it was careless. As the evening neared its end, she rose from the table, letting her gaze sweep across the room one last time. The young man stood near the entrance, collecting empty glasses. He looked up for a brief moment, not an invitation, not an inquiry, simply acknowledging her departure with quiet steadiness. And in that fleeting moment, she felt something in her chest loosen, as if for the first time all evening she had been seen without comparison. The morning of the wedding arrived wrapped in an early hush, the kind that softened the coastline and muted every sound beyond the gentle crash of waves below the cliffs. She woke before dawn, as she often did in moments of anticipation, her thoughts drifting between what she expected and what she feared. The inn remained quiet, its hallways still shadowed in the faint blue of first light. She stood by the window for a long moment, watching the horizon brighten, feeling an old heaviness settle inside her, the quiet kind that never left, only changed shape. As she dressed, she felt the familiar presence of memories rising, uninvited, but persistent. They came not as sharp recollections, but as sensations. Her mother's voice instructing her to stand straighter, her relatives commenting on how serious she looked as a teenager, their whispers comparing her to the sister who could illuminate any room simply by entering it. Those memories lingered in the seams of her childhood, stitched into her understanding of belonging. Even now, after decades of independence, they resurfaced in moments like this, when family gathered and old roles reclaimed their place. She left the room and walked toward the coastal path that led to the wedding hall. The air carried a cool mist, brushing gently against her skin. With each step, the echo of the past grew louder, not audible, but emotional. She thought of the many times she had swallowed discomfort to maintain peace, the many times she had allowed herself to fade into the background to avoid adding weight to already tense dynamics. None of it had made her lighter. It had only made her quieter. As she approached the hall, she noticed movement near the entrance. The young man stood there, setting up a final row of lanterns along the pathway. He worked with calm precision, as though each small task had meaning. When he looked up and saw her, he didn't react with surprise or hurry. Instead, he offered a simple, steady acknowledgement, an unspoken recognition that didn't impose or intrude. She felt a subtle shift inside her, the way one might feel when stepping momentarily into sunlight after a long stretch of shade. Inside the hall, last-minute preparations filled the space with quiet urgency. Florists adjusted stems, musicians tuned their instruments, and guests moved about in soft clusters, whispering about details they deemed important. She entered with composed steps, but the familiar sensation of being silently measured returned almost instantly. Relatives greeted her with warm smiles, their eyes scanning her with the same subtle assessments she remembered from years past. She responded politely, though her thoughts drifted inward. She tried to focus on the present, but the past clung to her, a collage of memories she had never fully voiced. She had been the dependable one, the stable one, the background against which her sister's brightness shone more vividly. She had carried burdens silently, believing that speaking them aloud would only create more distance. Over time, silence had become her shield. She moved toward a corner of the hall where a few lanterns cast gentle pools of light across the wooden floor. She found solace in the quiet there, away from the orbit of comparisons and assumptions. Standing alone, she let her shoulders relax, feeling momentarily removed from the expectations surrounding her. The young man entered the hall and crossed toward the stage area, carrying a box of small decorative pieces. Though he was busy, his attention seemed attuned to the room's undercurrents. When his gaze drifted toward her corner, it wasn't with curiosity. It was with the kind of understanding that came without explanation, as if he recognized the subtle gravity she carried. He walked past her, adjusting a lantern that hung slightly askew, his movements quiet and deliberate. She didn't speak, nor did he break the silence with any gesture that demanded a response. Yet something about his presence, calm, steady, unassuming, felt like a soft counterweight to the heaviness she had been holding. As guests began to fill the hall, she returned to her place among the family. The ceremony was about to begin. She stood in line with the others, listening to their murmured excitement, their subtle chiding about minor imperfections. None of it surprised her. She had learned long ago that every gathering was a stage upon which unspoken roles were reenacted. But as she prepared to take her first step down the aisle, she felt the weight of all the unspoken parts of her life press against her chest. Not the pain itself, but the years she had spent carrying it alone. She wondered if it had made her stronger or simply quieter. She wasn't sure. Then, for a brief moment, she felt a presence behind her, not intrusive, but steady. She glanced over her shoulder. The young man stood at a distance, adjusting a row of chairs. He wasn't looking at her, yet she sensed something in the air, a quiet reassurance made of nothing more than his simple existence. And in that fleeting moment, the weight she carried felt just a little lighter, not because anything had changed, but because she no longer felt completely unseen within it. The ceremony began beneath the soft glow of lanterns suspended from wooden beams, their warm light drifting across the hall like quiet breaths. Guests filled the rows, their voices settling into a hum of anticipation. She took her seat among relatives who shifted delicately, adjusting dresses and jackets, already rehearsing expressions of admiration for the bride. The air carried the subtle fragrance of roses layered over the faint scent of the sea, drifting in through slightly open windows. She folded her hands in her lap, maintaining her composed posture even as she felt the familiar tension rise inside her. Ceremonies had always been moments where comparisons flourished, not openly, but in glances, whispers, and the silent evaluations woven through every gesture. She could feel it now, the invisible lines forming around her, mapping out where she fit and where she didn't. As music began to play, guests turned their attention to the entrance. Her sister appeared in a cascade of soft white fabric, radiant and graceful, moving with the effortless poise she had always possessed. Murmurs of admiration filled the hall, accompanied by subtle nods that suggested confirmation of everything they already believed: her beauty, her charm, her place at the center of their orbit. She watched quietly, feeling both affection and distance intertwine within her. She wasn't envious. She had long accepted that her sister embodied a brightness she herself did not. Still, the contrast between them always felt amplified during moments like this, when the room collectively aligned itself around the younger woman. As the ceremony continued, she sensed a shift in the atmosphere, the gradual rise of murmurs, the flicker of glances directed toward her. At first, she ignored it, assuming it was her imagination. But the feeling grew, settling uncomfortably in her chest. She recognized the subtle tone of whispers, the kind that carried questions disguised as curiosity. She followed the direction of a few glances and noticed the young man standing near the back of the hall. He held a small case, likely helping the musicians or assisting with lighting adjustments. Though he blended into the background, his presence didn't go unnoticed. She saw how some relatives looked at him, then at her, their expressions shifting into quiet speculation. Their gaze carried assumptions, patterns they were eager to map onto her life. The discomfort rose like a tide, steady and unrelenting. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air felt heavy around her. The ceremony continued, each moment layered with the weight of attention she hadn't invited. As vows were exchanged, she kept her focus on the couple, forcing herself to hold her posture. But the whispers persisted, soft, barely audible, yet unmistakably pointed. She caught fragments of lowered voices, the kinds of tones families used when pretending to speak neutrally while actually rehearsing judgment. She shut her eyes briefly, letting the music wash over her. She had expected some discomfort, but not this. She had expected to navigate old comparisons, but not become the subject of new speculation, especially with someone she had barely exchanged a glance with. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed the young man looking toward her. His expression held no confusion or embarrassment, only a quiet steadiness, as if he sensed the shift in the room even from a distance. He didn't turn away when their eyes met. He remained still, grounding, unflinching. His calm gaze created a fragile thread of reassurance in a room that felt increasingly suffocating. As the ceremony reached its final moments, her discomfort grew sharper. One relative leaned slightly toward another, whispering behind a hand. Another tilted her head in the protagonist's direction with a knowing expression, as if confirming a theory no one had been brave enough to voice directly. Each gesture layered itself atop the last, forming an emotional pressure she hadn't anticipated. She inhaled slowly, keeping her face neutral. She would not let the weight of their assumptions break through her composure. She had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of quiet endurance. But even endurance had limits, and she felt her boundaries thinning beneath the scrutiny. When the ceremony ended, applause filled the hall. Guests rose to their feet, celebrating the couple with bright enthusiasm. She clapped along, her movements smooth and controlled, but she could feel heat rising along her skin, a mixture of embarrassment she didn't want to claim and frustration she didn't want to show. As the crowd began to disperse toward the reception area, she remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the chaos to pass around her. Her eyes drifted toward the back of the hall, where the young man was gathering a few cables. He looked up again, not intrusively, but with a quiet understanding that made her feel momentarily anchored. In a room filled with scrutiny, his presence felt like the only place where she wasn't being measured. The reception hall shifted into a new rhythm after the ceremony, the earlier tension dissolving into the hum of clinking glasses, layered conversations, and the rustle of people finding their places for the speeches. Lanterns cast a gentle glow across the room, illuminating faces flushed with excitement and relief. She took her seat near the center table, her posture composed though her chest still carried the quiet imprint of discomfort from earlier. The whispers, the speculative glances, the way people had mapped their assumptions onto her, they still echoed faintly, like distant waves hitting the cliffs. She smoothed the fabric of her dress and folded her hands neatly, doing what she had always done, holding herself together with quiet dignity. The room filled with an almost celebratory energy as guests refilled their glasses and prepared themselves for the parade of toasts. Her sister, radiant and breathless from the ceremony, sat at the head table surrounded by admiration. It was a scene she had witnessed countless times, a familiar constellation of attention orbiting her younger sibling. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, drawing the guests into a soft hush. A sequence of speeches had been planned. A few relatives, the best man, the maid of honor, and others eager to offer well-crafted words about love, family, and unity. She felt her breath tighten slightly. Speeches had always been moments when the family's dynamics were displayed with uncomfortable clarity, compliments delivered as comparisons, jokes that skirted too close to truths everyone avoided, subtle reminders of roles long ago assigned. The first speaker began, delivering a polished toast filled with sentimentality. Laughter rose at the expected moments, followed by warm applause. Another speech followed, lighter and more humorous, drawing easy reactions from the crowd. She listened carefully, offering polite smiles while maintaining the distance she needed to steady herself. As the sequence continued, she noticed movement at the edge of the room, the young man walking toward a small control panel near the stage. She hadn't expected to see him here during the speeches, yet there he was, adjusting the microphone levels with careful precision. His presence, though small in the grand scheme of the evening, felt strangely grounding. The soft hum of discomfort inside her eased just a little. Then came the moment that changed the room. The master of ceremonies announced the next speaker, but before he could say the name, the young man stepped away from the control panel and approached the stage. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. He wasn't on the list of speakers. Some guests exchanged puzzled glances. Others leaned slightly forward in their seats, anticipating some sort of technical announcement. She felt her body tense, not from fear, but from the sharp sense of the unexpected. He stood behind the microphone with a calmness that seemed almost out of place amid the glittering chaos of the reception. He took a moment, adjusting it to his height, and the hall slipped into a deeper silence. Even the restless guests quieted, drawn by the stillness of his posture. He didn't look toward her immediately. Instead, he looked across the crowd with a steady, composed expression, his presence neither apologetic nor hesitant. There was no uncertainty in his stance, no self-consciousness, no rush to justify why he was there. His confidence wasn't loud. It was anchored, deep, quiet. And then, slowly, his gaze shifted until it found her. The silence in the room deepened, tightening into something fragile. She felt every heartbeat sharpen in her chest. She told herself not to react, not to let anything show, but his eyes held hers with a sincerity she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even intimate. It was something else entirely. It was recognition. It was acknowledgement. It was the kind of attention that saw past surface-level judgments and touched the truth beneath. The guests noticed the direction of his gaze almost instantly. Whispers began at the edges of the hall, faint but unmistakable. She felt heat rise across her skin, not from shame, but from the sheer intensity of being seen so openly in a room where she had spent her entire life minimizing her presence. He drew a slow breath, preparing to speak, and in that suspended moment, before a single word left his lips, the room transformed. Every assumption people had constructed about her shifted into unease. Every quiet judgment that had floated beneath the surface now hung in the air like a fragile thread stretched too thin. She watched him, unable to predict what he would say, yet feeling somehow that the words, whatever they were, would alter something fundamental. His shoulders lifted slightly, as if he carried a truth he refused to soften. And then, in a voice steady enough to reach even the furthest corner of the hall, he began his speech. The first words he spoke carried through the hall with unexpected clarity, not loud, but unmistakably firm. Whatever guests had been expecting, a technical announcement, a brief note, an apology for interrupting, vanished instantly. His tone made it clear that this moment belonged to him, that he had stepped onto that stage with intention, not hesitation. She didn't move. She barely breathed. The room felt suspended, as if even the lanterns ceased their gentle sway. As he continued, his gaze returned to her with a steadiness that made heat bloom beneath her collarbone. He didn't waver, didn't rush, didn't disguise the direction of his words. His presence, so unassuming earlier in the day, now carried an emotional gravity that bent the room around him, and the guests felt it. The first visible reaction came from a distant cousin, her eyes widening, her posture stiffening as realization struck. Another relative followed, turning subtly in her seat to look at the protagonist, her expression tightening with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. One by one, faces shifted, expressions recalibrated, assumptions crumbled. A low murmur traveled through the hall. Small gusts of surprise disguised as coughs, whispered questions, the rustling of dresses as guests leaned toward one another. Even those who prided themselves on polished composure couldn't hide their reactions. Some eyebrows arched, some lips tightened. Some glanced between the young man and the protagonist with almost theatrical astonishment. Her sister, seated at the head table, paused mid-smile, her expression faltering for a fraction of a second. The shift was subtle, yet unmistakable, surprise blinking across her face before she quickly masked it. But the moment lingered, a crack in her usually flawless poise. The protagonist felt all of it, the weight of every stare, the sting of their curiosity, the sudden recoil of their assumptions being dismantled in real time. She had spent a lifetime being quietly minimized, her presence softened to make room for others. Now, in a single moment, the attention she had never sought wrapped itself around her like a too bright spotlight. Yet she didn't shrink. She remained still, her spine straight, her hands steady in her lap. The young man's voice, a calm, unwavering current, held her in place, creating a strange pressure and relief at the same time. It was as though his words were building a space around her she had never been allowed to occupy before. Across the room, expressions continued to shift in waves. One aunt pressed her fingers against her lips, astonished. An uncle adjusted his jacket nervously, glancing away as if unsure where propriety now stood. Two cousins exchanged rapid looks, their eyes darting between the two of them with disbelief so visible it almost broke through their facade of politeness. But more striking than the shock was the discomfort. The people who had always felt confident in their evaluations of her now struggled to recalibrate. The narrative they had written about her, framed by comparisons, long-standing hierarchies and quiet judgments, no longer fit. The young man's words had disrupted the unspoken structure of the family's perceptions, and the sudden imbalance left many visibly unsettled. Her sister shifted slightly in her seat, her jaw tightening in an attempt to maintain composure. She glanced at the protagonist, her expression flickering with something mixed. Confusion, perhaps, or annoyance at losing command of the room's emotional direction. For the first time that day, the comparison between them wavered, no longer so neatly defined, no longer so easily upheld. The speech continued, each sentence gentle yet firm, like a series of steady knocks on a long-shut door. He didn't raise his voice, but every word seemed to carve into the silence left behind. She could feel the emotional landscape shifting beneath her feet, and as the room absorbed his words, the protagonist sensed a strange transformation happening around her. The judgment she had felt earlier, the stares, the whispers, the hidden evaluations, began to turn inward. People who had watched her with subtle condescension now avoided meeting her eyes, as if facing her meant confronting their own assumptions. It wasn't vindication she felt. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, deeper, a fragile release from a weight she had carried for decades. Not because someone defended her, but because someone finally saw her fully enough to interrupt the narrative that had followed her for most of her life. When the young man reached the end of his speech, a final profound silence overtook the hall. No applause came immediately. People were still too stunned, too off balance, too caught between what they had believed and what had just been revealed at the center of the room. He stepped away from the microphone with unhurried composure. He didn't bow, didn't look around for approval, didn't search for reactions. Instead, he glanced at her, just once, just long enough to anchor her again, and then moved back toward the shadows near the wall. The room remained suspended. She felt the shift not only around her, but inside her, quiet, steady, irreversible. The silence he left behind felt heavier than the speech itself. When he stepped away from the microphone, the room remained suspended, as if no one dared to breathe too loudly or shift too abruptly. She sat completely still, her heartbeat echoing in her chest with a rhythm both fragile and fierce. The weight of every stare pressed against her, but the shame she expected did not come. Instead, something unexpected rose to the surface, an overwhelming vulnerability she had spent decades learning to contain. She felt the edges of herself soften in that stillness. The armor she always carried, the quiet composure, the careful restraint, the steady acceptance of being overlooked, seemed to melt just slightly, not disappear, but loosen, as though his words had untied a knot that had been tightened for too many years. She didn't know whether to breathe deeper or hide her trembling hands beneath the tablecloth. Around her, guests struggled to recover their footing. Some looked anywhere but at her, their eyes darting to the ceiling, the floor, their glasses. Others could not look away, their curiosity sharpened by disbelief. A few whispered behind half-covered mouths, trying to reassemble a narrative that had crumbled too quickly for them to disguise their confusion. Her sister, still sitting at the head table, appeared poised yet unsettled. She kept adjusting small details, her bracelet, a strand of hair, the napkin on her lap, as if grounding herself in the familiar would help her regain control. But nothing seemed to settle her expression entirely. There was something new in her gaze when she looked toward the protagonist, a flicker of uncertainty, even vulnerability of her own. The protagonist lowered her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She felt suddenly exposed, not because of anything shameful, but because someone had recognized her so openly in a space where she had always been quietly diminished. That recognition was too intense, too honest, too unexpected. It pierced through years of silence, calling forth emotions she had learned to suppress for the sake of maintaining harmony. She lifted her gaze again and found the young man standing near the far wall, partially hidden by shadows cast from a row of lanterns. He wasn't watching the crowd. His attention was fixed solely on her. The steadiness in his expression hadn't shifted. It remained calm, grounded, unshaken by the weight of his own actions. He offered no apology, no explanation, no nervous half-smile. Instead, his eyes held a quiet solidarity, as though he understood the emotional storm he had stirred and refused to let her face it alone. She held that gaze for a fraction of a second longer than she intended. Something inside her opened, not dramatically but subtly, like a locked window cracking enough to let in air after years of stillness. It wasn't affection. It wasn't romance. It was something quieter and more profound, the realization that she wasn't as invisible as she had come to believe. The master of ceremonies finally broke the silence with an awkwardly composed laugh, announcing the next speech. A few guests clapped cautiously, as if trying to restore normalcy. But the atmosphere wasn't the same. The evening had been split in two, the moments before his words and the moments after. Nothing fit neatly anymore. As the next speaker rambled through a predictable toast, she felt disconnected from the noise. Her mind drifted inward, navigating emotions she had long avoided. She remembered how often she had silenced herself to preserve peace, how many times she had diminished her own feelings to avoid seeming dramatic or difficult. She had grown accustomed to being the steady one, the one who didn't need defending, the one who didn't break. But sitting there, with his words still echoing in the air, she realized that her silence had never been absence. It had been armor, an armor he had somehow surprisingly seen through. When the speech ended, applause rose again, but she barely heard it. Her focus remained on her hands folded in her lap, now trembling slightly. She drew in a deep breath, trying to calm the rising swell inside her, but it only seemed to expand further, an emotional fullness that refused to be compressed back into quiet endurance. A few relatives approached her table, offering hesitant smiles that didn't match their uncertain eyes. They spoke to her gently, cautiously, as if unsure whether to ask questions or avoid them entirely. For once, she didn't feel the urge to reassure them or ease their discomfort. She simply nodded, offering minimal response. The young man moved discreetly along the edge of the room, gathering a few items left near the stage. Though others barely noticed him now, she could feel his presence like a steady pulse in the background, grounding her in ways she didn't yet understand. She rose from her seat for a moment, needing space. As she moved toward a quieter corner, she felt no shame. Instead, she felt her vulnerability expanding into something surprisingly strong, an awakening, a shift, a release. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew the weight she had carried alone for so long had been seen, acknowledged, and gently lifted, not erased, but shared. And when she looked toward him again, she felt a stillness settle inside her, soft but unmistakable. The reception moved into a softer rhythm after the speeches, but the room never fully recovered its earlier ease. The atmosphere felt cracked, as though something delicate had been dropped and everyone was pretending not to notice the pieces on the floor. Guests spoke in quieter tones, measuring their words more carefully. Laughter still floated here and there, but it came forced at times, pressed into spaces where it didn't quite belong. She stood near the edge of the hall, allowing the distance to soothe her. The open windows let in the evening air, carrying the scent of the ocean and the faint music drifting from the musicians who had resumed playing. She wrapped her arms loosely around herself, not out of fear or discomfort, but simply to feel grounded. People passed by her with hesitant smiles. Some avoided her gaze entirely, as if acknowledging her meant acknowledging their own misjudgments. Others looked at her with a newfound caution, a tentative recognition that suggested they were reassessing everything they thought they knew about her. No one approached directly. Not yet. They hovered at the edges, unsure of how to re-enter her orbit without rubbing against the truth that had been laid bare. Her sister finally stepped down from the head table and approached her. For a moment, the protagonist felt a flicker of the old dynamic, bracing herself for comparison, for a soft critique wrapped in concern. But her sister's expression held something different this time. Not dominance, not effortless poise, something almost fragile. Still, no words were exchanged. Her sister offered a small, tight smile and moved on. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a crack in the old script, a sign that the unspoken hierarchy between them had shifted, even if neither knew what that meant yet. The young man had returned to assisting near the side of the hall, but he didn't blend into the background anymore. His presence had become a subtle gravitational force that guests unconsciously avoided, as if proximity to him meant being pulled into the truth he had spoken. Yet he remained steady, unbothered by the discomfort swirling around him. At one point, their paths crossed near the lantern-lit wall. He wasn't carrying anything, nor adjusting decor. He simply happened to walk by. When their eyes met, she felt her breath settle in her chest. Not deepen, not quicken, simply settle. His expression held the same calm resolve as before, but now there was something gentler there too, a recognition of what she had endured since his speech. He paused, not fully stopping, not demanding anything, just allowing a moment of presence to settle between them. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But the silence that passed was not awkward. It was grounding, warm, and unexpectedly steadying. He moved on, and she felt a surprising sense of clarity wash through her. As the evening progressed, the subtle rupture within the family became more evident. Some relatives kept their distance, clearly uncertain about how to navigate the new narrative. Others approached her carefully, though their questions remained unspoken, their curiosity constrained by fear of revealing too much. A few attempted to behave as if nothing had changed at all, but their discomfort betrayed them. For the first time in years, she felt the dynamic shift away from the quiet hierarchy that had defined every family gathering. She was no longer the silent presence at the periphery. Even without speaking, she had been thrust into the center, not by choice, but by truth. And she did not shrink from it. Later in the evening, she stepped outside onto the small terrace overlooking the cliffs. The sea was dark beneath the fading light, its movements steady and rhythmic. She breathed in deeply, letting the cool air cleanse the tightness lingering in her chest. She heard footsteps behind her, slow, measured. She didn't turn immediately, but she knew instinctively who it was. When she finally looked back, the young man stood a few steps away, keeping a respectful distance. The lantern behind him cast a soft outline along his shoulders, giving him an almost quiet glow. He didn't approach further. He didn't offer an expression that demanded response. He simply existed in her space with the same calm certainty he had carried all day. And that presence, steady, unwavering, unintrusive, felt like an anchor she hadn't realized she needed. She turned her gaze back to the sea, and he remained behind her, silent but near, a quiet shield against the storm of assumptions and whispered questions waiting inside. In the vast stillness of the terrace, she felt the quiet rupture within the family echo inside her, but instead of fear, she felt possibility. When the last song drifted into silence and the hall began to empty, the atmosphere settled into a softer, quieter version of itself. Lanterns flickered gently overhead, their warm light dimming as the night deepened. She remained on the terrace for a moment longer, letting the cool air calm the currents still moving through her chest. The sea stretched beneath the cliff in steady motions, its rhythm now more soothing than heavy. Everything felt suspended between an ending and a beginning. Eventually, she re-entered the hall. Most guests had already left or were gathering their belongings, their once lively energy now reduced to murmurs and tired movements. The earlier tension had loosened, though not entirely vanished. People walked carefully, as if the floor carried fragile threads they feared breaking. She noticed the way a few relatives glanced at her with cautious acknowledgement. No longer dismissive, no longer superior, but unsure, perhaps even humbled. Others avoided her gaze completely, retreating into small circles where they could rewrite the evening to fit their comfort. She did not chase or resent any of it. For the first time, she felt no urge to shrink for the sake of maintaining balance. Her stillness felt different now, no longer the silence of someone pushed aside, but the calm of someone who had survived an unexpected unveiling of truth. The wedding planner began collecting scattered decorations. Musicians packed their instruments. A few lanterns swayed gently from the rafters, as if echoing the faint emotional residue that lingered in the room. She walked slowly between tables, absorbing the atmosphere without feeling burdened by it. The heaviness she had carried all day, the weight of assumptions, the echoes of comparisons, seemed to have been stripped clean from her shoulders. Her sister approached briefly, her steps measured. The protagonist sensed hesitation before anything else, an unfamiliar uncertainty threading through her sister's normally seamless presence. Her expression was softer now, touched by something reflective. They exchanged a quiet, almost fragile moment of eye contact. It held neither apology nor confrontation, but it carried recognition, an understanding that the balance between them had shifted permanently. Without a word, her sister moved on, leaving behind a trace of something that felt strangely like respect. She exhaled slowly, realizing how deeply she had longed for that subtle shift, far more than any spoken explanation could ever offer. Across the hall, the young man was arranging the last of the lanterns, extinguishing each flame with a soft, practiced motion. Even now, after everything that had unfolded, he worked without asking for attention or validation. His movements remained calm, deliberate, anchored in the quiet steadiness that had made his presence feel so grounding throughout the day. She watched him for a moment, not with awe or confusion, but with a kind of gentle clarity. His actions during the speeches, the calm boldness with which he had stepped into a moment that didn't belong to him, had not been impulsive. They had come from a place of sincerity, conviction, and an unspoken understanding she still could not fully explain. He noticed her gaze and paused, not abruptly, but softly, as though acknowledging her without disrupting the calm he carried. She felt something settle inside her, a quiet acceptance of his presence and of her own reaction to it. She wasn't accustomed to being seen with such quiet intensity, especially in a room where she had always been overshadowed. And yet, she didn't feel exposed now. She felt understood. She walked toward the window near the back of the hall, where a few candles still flickered. The scattered reflections in the glass showed people gathering coats, hugging goodbye, stepping into the night with softened voices. Behind those reflections, she could see herself, no longer small, no longer peripheral, but standing firmly in the aftermath of an emotional shift she hadn't anticipated when the day began. The young man finished his final task and set the empty crate aside. For a moment, he simply stood still, observing the hall as if taking a final mental imprint of the evening. Then he walked toward the terrace door, passing near her without haste or hesitation. He paused at a respectful distance, just close enough to acknowledge the shared gravity of the day. A faint current passed between them, quiet, steady, unspoken. She didn't move toward him, nor did he step closer. The moment didn't need more than what it already held, a recognition that something genuine had been exchanged in the midst of chaos, and that whatever remained would unfold naturally, without expectation or pressure. He stepped outside, letting the night air carry him away from the lantern glow. She watched him go, not with longing, but with an unhurried sense of possibility. His presence had opened a door inside her she had long kept closed, a door she had forgotten she needed. And even now, as he disappeared into the shadows near the cliff's edge, she felt no fear of the distance between them. His influence lingered, not as a promise, but as a quiet shift in her understanding of herself. She remained in the hall a little longer, allowing the final guests to drift out. When she finally stepped into the night, the air felt different, lighter, clearer, unburdened. The day had exposed old wounds, challenged familiar hierarchies, and dismantled assumptions she had carried all her life. Yet she didn't feel broken by it. She felt expanded. As she walked back toward the inn along the lantern-lined path, she sensed the residue of his speech still echoing behind her. Not as a disruption, but as a turning point. Something had changed. Not between them, but within her. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough.